I've made the parallel sides, right? I've tapered the tips in down to the nocks, and then I went ahead and just removed the bulk of the bellywood here. So these limbs right now are probably, I don't know, 16, 17, 18 mils thick.
All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome to episode 2 of this most fantastic pod venture. If you're watching on YouTube again, and if you're not, I'm going to describe it. We're sitting down at shave horses, and they're actually in a very amazing apparatus. It's a chair that swivels. It's got a footrest. The front of it swivels. It's got like a foot-operated clamp that you can clamp your bow down in, as you can see with Jim over here.
I'm the demonstrator. And
this is about where Jim and I have been posted up for the last 2.25 days.
It's become quite comfortable.
We've been working on bows with Mr. Clay Hayes. We're down in the panhandle of Florida right now on the Hayes Ranch. So we had in the previous podventure, which I definitely recommend the previous podcast of this podventure.
Yes.
I recommend everybody tune into that because that was a good one. We introduced Clay. We talk a lot about his history and how he got into hunting and how he got into bow building, his time with the natural resources and all that good stuff. So anyway, lots of really, really interesting stuff there. But now we're going to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of the what and the how of what we've been doing the last couple days here,
super cool
Clay.
thing that we've done here.
So, and we're actually, our bows, Jim, are outside drying right now.
Yep, we put that little coating on them, the urethane.
Yeah, what was the coating that we just put on them to kind of finish them, Clay?
Just spar urethane.
Spar urethane, which that's one of the more final steps. We're going to back up there, and we're going to talk about exactly how one might go about building a bow.
Yes.
As well as, which I'm gonna spoiler alert, I'm gonna give you the best tip of how to build a bow. You come down here with Clay or up to Idaho and you build one with him.
Correct. I was going to say the same exact thing.
But Clay, where do we start? Where would you start with this?
Probably, yeah.
Well, you start with a tree.
The tree is highly important.
Yeah.
And not just any old tree.
That's right. So most of the bows that I make are made out of a species called Osage orange, and it grows mostly in the Midwest, but there's also a band of it on the Black Prairie area of central Alabama, and also up the Mississippi, up into northeast Mississippi. And that's where a lot of this wood came from, is around the Montgomery, Alabama area. And I go up there and cut this Osage, split it up, stick it in a barn for a couple of years and let it dry.
Now that's a very simplified version of what happens because first off, I'm curious, why Osage? Why not a maple or a pine or whatever? And then also, it's not even just any old Osage. Once you might finally find an Osage and be like, oh, good, now I'm in the clear, but not even necessarily that.
Yeah, so we'll start with why Osage. So there's a lot of different woods that you can make bows out of, and a lot of different woods will make pretty good bows. Osage, in my opinion, is probably the best, and it's available here close by, and so that's what I'm naturally going to use. But if you're interested in bow making and you don't have access to Osage, you don't need to worry about it. You can make bows out of hard maple, like rock maple, and things like that. You can make them out of hickory, hornbeam, elms, Pacific yew, or vine maple if you're out west, like on the west coast. Yeah. So there's lots of different species that'll make bows, so don't get hung up on that. But like I said, if you do have Osage, that's like top rung. That's top shelf stuff. But as you said, not just any Osage. You're just not going to go out and say, there's an Osage tree right there. I'm going to make a bow out of that. You could get lucky and find one, but normally Osage tends to be a very gnarly tree, so it grows all twisted and knotty and crooked. And so most of the time you have to look through. You have to kind of high grade it. You got to look through a bunch of trees to find one that's worth cutting, because it's a lot of work to cut that tree and then to split it and age it and all that stuff.
Because they don't make themselves easy to cut, do they?
No, they don't make themselves easy. Osage tends to grow in clumps, and so when it's difficult to fell these trees, because when you cut one, the branches they're all interwoven with other trees, and they just don't fall. And so there's a lot of like limbing and cutting and things like that. And then to add to that, they're thorny. Oftentimes they're covered in poison ivy. So it's not an enjoyable process to go cut bow wood. It's a lot of sticky, hard, hot work.
The wood better be dank. I mean, is it not to go back to that, but is it super hard or something?
It's very dense. It's heavy. It's incredibly heavy. If you were to pick up a good piece of Osage versus pine or something like that, it would be very noticeable, the difference in the weight of that wood.
Are those similar attributes that those other types of wood have that you can make bows out of, or do they all kind of carry the same thing, or they're just their own animal, but you can still make a bow out of it?
Yeah, they all have their unique characteristics, and you would just design the bow to take advantage of those characteristics. Like Osage tends to do well. Like the type of design that I like to use is maybe around 1.25 inches to 1 3/8 wide, 60 to 64 inches long, and then the limbs, when it's all said and done, they end up about somewhere between 13 and 15 millimeters thick. If I was to be building bows out of something like a hard maple or a hickory or something like that, I might make it a little bit wider or a little bit longer, because those woods aren't typically as good at resisting compression. And when that's a very important characteristic of a good bow wood, is its ability to withstand or resist compression and also tension. And so if you think about when you are shooting a bow and holding the bow, the back of the bow is the part that faces away from you. The belly is the part that faces you as you're holding this thing. Well, when you draw a bow, the belly is being compressed or trying to be crushed, and the back is under tension. It's trying to pull those fibers apart. And so good bow wood has to be able to withstand both of those forces.
Yeah. I mean, I'm picturing like in an extreme scenario, but even when you just break a stick, it seems like, you break a stick like this, and like you said, those fibers on the backside want to come apart.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's why back in the day, I mean, way back when, they weren't even trad bows at that time. They were pretty modern bows, but they were making them out of like the belly had, a horn or a bone or some sort of material there, and the backside had that sinew, right?
Yep.
And that was the idea of getting something that's really resisting compression, that's something that's also stretching.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of a composite bow. That's not a self bow, but it's a natural composite bow. And the reason that they use that combination of materials is because on the belly side, the horn is incredibly resistant to compression. I mean, it's like way beyond wood. And the sinew is very, very good at withstanding that tension force. I mean, think about its function in a living body. That's what it does.
Yeah.
And so by marrying those two and compositing those two, you have the just amazing tool that performs very well.
Yeah. So self bow, though, like you just said there, those aren't self bow necessarily because they're multiple materials. Self bow is like all one material. You just basically, it's in the wood somewhere. You just expose it by getting rid of everything that's not the bow.
Yep.
According to Clay.
So getting back to the trees real quick though. So we're talking about how Osage grows and like twisty, gnarly, and it sounds like I can just picturing it, hung up in other trees and poison ivy. I mean, it sounds like you said,
wonderful.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. Like you said, you want to go through all that work. You want to pick the right tree. So what does I feel like it's like one of those dating shows. Describe your perfect tree, Clay.
Yeah.
So when I'm going through the woods, I'm looking for, first of all, Osage. And then once I found a group of Osage, I'm looking at this group of trees, and I'm trying to find one that has a relatively straight section. And then another big thing that I'm looking for is I'm reading the bark, and I'm looking for one that does not spiral around the tree. And you can see that, you can see that spiral in the bark if you look down one of those things, because what happens on the bark is also happening underneath the bark in the wood. And so And so if you cut one of those trees that has that bark that spirals around the tree, when you go to split that, your stave is going to have a twist to it. Now that's, as you guys saw during your bow building process, that's not a deal breaker. You can fix that. But if we're talking like perfect ideal tree, it's not. I'm gonna try to avoid that. Basically, like if I were to find a perfect tree, it would be a stovepipe with straight up bark, straight grain.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's your ideal
That's
tree.
very, very rare.
And so that, once you get it down, part of the reason, like you said, is that when you start splitting it. Now, this was pretty interesting. I thought it was one of the first things we did when we got here is we saw you splitting up a big section of tree. And this was where the idea of finding the bow in the tree, so to speak, really first started to come to light, because you might think you're starting with something really big and you're trying to get it down to this small, relatively petite bow inside. So you're going to start, you're going to get out the big old giant like lumber saw, and you're going to run it along the saw a couple times, make it a nice square, and then, figure out a bunch of stuff. Just keep sawing stuff off until you get to that shape. But instead, you're working with the tree. Everything is working with these grains in the tree and splitting the tree and figuring out what way it wants to split. That's part of the reason why finding a straight one, I'm sure, is mighty helpful.
Yeah. So you wouldn't want to saw a stave out of one of these trees, because when you do that, you're going against the grain, especially, if you have a piece of wood that has a little bit of wiggle in the grain, or maybe it has a little bit of spiral in it. And so if you saw, you've got grain that runs across the limb, and that just creates a weak point. So ideally, when I create a bow, I want that grain to run all the way from one end up through the bow to the other end. And it's the same way if you're picking out axe handles, like a good hickory axe handle, like you want that grain to run all the way up it, right? You don't want that grain running across that axe handle, because that's just a weak point, and it'll eventually break there.
Sure. Yeah, you described it as the frosting layers between different layers of cake. And usually your cake always comes apart at that frosting layer.
Yeah.
When you don't want it to.
What so on an average, I guess, log, if you will, how many staves are you cutting out of that then?
It really depends on the tree, obviously how big the tree is. But let's say my ideal tree is going to be 12 inches diameter, it's going to be a perfect cylinder, and it's going to be straight. I could get maybe 12 staves out of that thing.
Oh, wow.
But that's if everything goes perfect.
Yeah.
Sure.
And it never goes perfect.
That one we split the other day, how many do you think you'll get out of that one?
I'll probably get 6 staves out of that.
Okay.
All right. And to give an idea of a stave, too, for those watching on YouTube, they can see we're surrounded by staves currently. And they're about, oh gosh, I don't even know how to give an idea on size of them. What do you know generally what size he's come out to? It's
these are probably a little over 6 feet, and I don't know, maybe 2.5 inches across the back side here, which would be this.
Because they kind of come out looking like a pie.
Yeah, they're kind of pie-shaped.
Pie-shaped cross-section. But
getting back to the density of this wood, too. This is just so heavy. It does not look like it should be as heavy as it is.
Yep. Yeah, and that's one of the characteristics of good wood. Even within Osage, there's heavy wood and then there's light wood, and typically the heavier wood is going to make the better bow.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't oak super heavy wood? They make bows out of oak.
Yeah, we have some live oak up above us here that's sawn into slabs for tabletops, and that stuff it's terribly heavy. Doesn't make a very good bow.
Weird.
Yeah, it's I don't know what it is, but it's it'll make a bow. It's just not going to perform as well as an equivalent Osage bow.
Interesting. One of the other notable things is, let's say you go out, you find the perfect Osage, you chop it down. Great, now it's time to make a bow. Oh, wait, no, it's not. In 2 years or so, thereabouts, we'll be making a bow with that. Okay, so you split them out into these staves, and we went into your sort of your dry box here, if you will, your storage. And there's staves that have been sitting in there since the 90s. There's staves that have been sitting in there since recent times. You got them. I mean, they have to age like fine wine or old barrels of whiskey or something.
Yep. So Osage in particular, because it is so dense, it takes a long time to dry. And dry wood is important, because if you start making a bow, if you start bending that wood when it's too wet, it doesn't have that resiliency to snap back to its original shape. And that's really one of the markers of good wood, is when you bend it, it pops right back. It doesn't stay bent. But if the wood is too green, it just it stays bent. It's
Sure.
like if you're bending, parts for a chair, something like that. You would steam that wood, bend it, get some moisture in it, and then let it dry like that. And it's going to retain that shape. So the aging process is important for a lot of bow woods, but Osage in particular. But with that said, you could take a wood like hickory. You could go out. We could go right now to the river bottom. We could hack down a hickory tree, strip the bark off, make a bow out of it, not bend it until it's dry, but we could rough one out, and then it's going to dry because it's much reduced in its bulk.
Sure.
It's going to dry much, much faster. And you could have a bow done out of that in a month, whereas you're talking years with Osage.
How about one of those like hard maples? You get it at Home Depot. You just buy yourself like a big board.
Oh yeah, that's a great way, and a great way for people to get started, because they can go get a piece of hard maple for $10, 1x2, and you need to back it with something. So that means make a composite bow. So you glue rawhide or something else to the back to take that tension force, and you can make a bow out of that. But it's not going to make. Probably not going to make a great bow.
Yeah.
But when you're first starting, unless you have someone that knows what they're doing looking over your shoulder, it's not about making the best bow in history. It's about learning about making bows, because there's a lot of stuff to learn. There's a lot of mistakes to make, and you need to be able to make those mistakes so that you can learn from them. And so it's a lot easier to stomach making a mistake on a $10 board than a $100 piece of Osage.
For sure.
Yeah.
No, for sure. And
10 times easier, as a matter of fact.
Yes. I think, like we said earlier, probably the best tip is, if you've never done this before, is I feel like it's like, infomercial for Clay's class, but also I equate it to if you're going to go steelhead fishing for the first time. Clay, you love steelhead fishing.
I love it. I love it. I dream about it.
Seriously, he would rather do nothing else than steelhead fishing.
This might be it. This might be one point where Clay and I disagree. But let's say you're like, I'm going to start steelhead fishing. If you went out with a guide for just one day, your knowledge and skill level, would skyrocket. You'd be off to the races, and doing this class, you could do this class, build a bow, be completely satisfied, and have this amazing bow at the end of the class that you're super proud of, that you put a ton of work into. It's your bow, your hands made it, which would be amazing. But also, I think it also might spark that you want to try it again on your own. And I think, man, having that first hand of somebody, guiding you through that process is truly invaluable. Now, like you were saying earlier, though, if you're not going to do that, I would have been petrified. I'd have been petrified wood if somebody handed me an Osage stave and said, "All right, go make a bow." Because you are going to make those mistakes. Heck, I showed up here, Jim, and I'm like, a rasp only cuts one way. Interesting.
Good to know.
But now, I don't know if I could, go full on, be like, I'm going to go make a bow tomorrow. But I'm light years ahead of where I would have been.
It's true. Very much true.
Yeah, it really cuts the learning curve, but it's not necessary. You don't have to come learn how to build a bow. I've got tons of the YouTube videos showing you how. It's just, I can show you things that you're gonna have to make the mistakes to learn. You know, so it kind of saves you on some of that stuff.
Yeah, it does. Man, but carrying on, like, you know, let's say, so you do get either you purchase a stave that somebody's already done the whole like 2-year wait thing on, whatever, you can do that, or you go and do it yourself and you've waited long enough. You know, I think the whole forming process of working the stave into a bow, I mean, it takes quite some time. If you have time to dedicate to it, as we've shown, we basically did it essentially in 2 days. But that was 2 days of straight work. Had we been more experienced in woodworking, I'm sure we could have done it a little bit quicker. I mean, Clay apparently can hammer one out in an hour and a half. So then when he said that, we really tucked our tails and in inadequacy.
If he was getting frustrated, it wasn't showing, because I'm sitting there going, like, you're like, oh, how long does it take to make one? He's like, oh, I can have it knocked out in about an hour and a half. I'm working real hard. I'm like, oh man, like,
took me like an hour and a half.
Like, I wonder if he's just like mentally pulling his hair out, you know.
It's all gone.
That's why he shaves his head. Yeah. But you know, I think even the way that we started, we got bows here sitting in front of us, but working with the grain in the wood and seeing, I looked at tree rings a way I've never looked at tree rings before. I mean, there's like this early wood and late wood, and trying to work out this early wood, which is kind of this chippy, kind of crunchy stuff, and the late wood's the more like, I guess, not chippy, crunchy stuff. It's more like what you'd want out of a bow. You know, and working like the whole backside of the bow is basically that is one ring, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's all wild stuff. I mean, and why are we doing that?
So the back of the bow, again, getting back to the forces that are applied to the bow when it's been shot, you know, the back is under tension, right? And so if you were to be cut through a bunch of different rings, that just gives areas for those rings to come apart. Yeah. And so by having one continuous annual growth ring along the back, you know, all those fibers are in the same plane. They're all connected and interlocked, and it just gives a more durable backing that can withstand that tension force.
Yeah. And rings are going to come apart realistically at that. There's the early wood and the late wood. They're going to come apart at that early wood. It's almost like it's almost a bit porous.
Yeah, it is. And so you can imagine if you know, on the back, if you have two different, if instead of having a continuous growth ring like that, if you have two on stacked on top and they're cut through, you know, that one, just like you said, that early wood layer gives a place for it to come apart.
Yeah. And this late wood here that then we wind up with running the whole length of the back, it's almost like it seals in everything underneath it, just with that one strong layer. It's pretty wild. I mean, when you think about something that's 60 plus inches long and it's all one tree ring, you know, you look down at a tree ring when you have a cross section of a tree and you're like, look at those little things, little baby things. We have that running the entire length down here. It's pretty cool. But I mean, it takes some time, it takes some effort, and we got some of the tools here we should probably show. I mean, not only are we sitting at this, what was it called? Draw horse?
Shave
horse.
These are actually called stave masters.
Stave masters.
Ooh. Yeah, technical.
All
fancy.
Right. It takes some tools. Now, it takes more than just the ones that I'm holding up here, but we have, Clay, what are your most used tools in this process? I know I have two of them.
So in your left hand there is a draw knife, and that's an old vintage Greenlee draw knife that all of my draw knives were inherited. They've just always been around here. They probably belong to my grandfather and my great uncles. They've just kind of worked their way down. They've always been here.
Greenlee makes a good.
What were they using them for, do you think?
Heck if I know. Making ox yokes, I guess.
Okay.
And then in your right hand there is the wood grater.
The wood grater. That is a great way to describe it. That is what it is. Otherwise known as a rasp.
Yeah, that's actually a farrier's rasp, so it's for horseshoeing. Yeah.
Oh, no kidding, huh?
Yep.
Oh, nice. Is that Is that out of just because it's what was here, because we're on a horse ranch, or is it because you think it's best?
Well, they are very good. They are very good tools, but that's what I started with because my brother was a farrier, and I would always get his old rasps. And those rasp, the horseshoers that come here to the place, I just get their old rasp, and they're a little bit. They don't have quite the edge that they want for shoeing horses, but they still work great for building bows.
Yeah, on wood.
Yep.
So we're using that a lot. I mean, you're using the draw knife at first you're getting away big chunks of wood, trying to get down to that level, one particular ring. Some of the other stuff that we're using was just even like these little pieces, just little cards of steel.
Yep, little cabinet scraper.
Yeah, and that was used to scrape away some of the wood. But how do you see as a bow maker, you've got that back, let's say, but then you have all this kind of just crazy wood on top. How do you see it all? Like, where's the bow in there, and how do you get down to it?
Well, I mean, you got to look at how the wood lays. You got to look at how the grain runs. And the way that I typically do it is I'll split the stave out, and then however that splits, I'll clean up one side. If you grab this stave here behind you, Marco, shoot, I'm talking about. So you can see this side's kind of all rough and everything.
Yeah.
This is just the way the thing's split out. And then on this side, it's I've got this more yellow. So this, just to back up, this wood is actually like it reacts to UV light. Mm-hmm. And so it'll turn dark as it's longer it's exposed to light. And so this darker colored stuff here has just been exposed longer. And this yellow, really vibrant yellow stuff was stuff that I just took off yesterday and exposed that wood underneath.
Okay.
And so after I've got the wood or the stave split out, I'll go ahead and clean one side up with a draw knife so it's nice and smooth and it's still going with the grain. And then I'll take a compass and a pencil or Sharpie or something like that and set it to about 1 3/8 1.5 or so wide, and use this side that I already cleaned up as a guide to scribe a line that parallels it.
Okay.
And so then I'll bring this rough side into that, and then I'll end up with a parallel stave that goes perfectly with the grain.
This is going to be the back of this bow here,
This will be the back of the bow, because this was the way that this stave set in the tree was like this, right? The tree would have been like this.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And this was the outside facing ring. But once you've got that, I mean, that's a big part of the process. Then all you have to do is taper the limb tips in, at whatever degree you want. And typically I'll go from about 35 millimeters wide, the widest part of the limb, and I'll taper down to about 10 mils on the nocks, and I'll do that over about half of the limb. Figure out how long you want it, and knock all the wood off on the belly and get it bending and put a string on it.
Yeah. One of the things that I found supremely interesting was the fact that the bow doesn't need to be, it doesn't have to be straight in some of the regards that you might think it has to be straight. So that is where I'm going to hold up this bad boy that Clay, you have been working on. This is not my bow, because this would be complicated. Having to try and taper the end with all this stuff going on. But if you're watching on YouTube, you can see. If you're not watching on YouTube, imagine just like a serpent. That's what this looks like, but in wood. And it's crazy because at your handle here, from the handle going out to the limbs, I mean, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 changes of direction or bends just on one limb. And the other one we have about an equal amount. And that part doesn't really matter from what you've said. There are parts that have to line up on this thing in order for it to work well. But I mean, even if you look at it from this other side, it's kind of twisting, funny. This thing is downright wacky.
I mean, that thing looks about as snaky as it gets. But Jim, that was my big question. So what on this does have to line up so it will still function as a bow?
So the only points that really need to line up are the nocks with the center of the handle, right? If you drew a line right from the nock,
the very end,
through to, so if I took a string and stretched from here to here, it would need to bisect this handle.
Okay.
The reason being, if you think about, if you hold a bow like this and both limb tips are over this way. Well, when you grab that string, the bow's gonna twist in your hand.
Torque, yeah.
And so if you have those,
it's gonna what, Jim?
I said torque, but it sounded like twerk.
I wouldn't even have caught that, Mark, if you would have said anything.
I heard it even as it came out of my mouth. It came out wrong. Sorry.
But yeah, if they're lined up, when you pull that pressure on there, it's gonna put that force straight into your hand versus trying to twist the bow.
Gotcha.
Right.
Well, and as we worked our bows into bow shape, they didn't just end up lining up. We had to do some things there. We used a lot of heat and some
clamps.
Some clamps. And some jigs, I guess. Is that what you call that?
A little bit of muscle.
A little bit of muscle. So maybe talk a little bit about that. And actually, I want to get back to the belly of the bow a little bit, too.
Well, we'll get to the belly.
Yeah, so, I mean, once you've got the rough shape out, and like this one here is kind of to that point, you know, so I've made the parallel sides, right? I've tapered the tips in down to the nocks, and then I went ahead and just removed the bulk of the belly wood here. So these limbs right now are probably, I don't know, 16, 17, 18 mils thick. And then through the tillering process, I'm going to work that down even farther. So I will get into tillering here in a little bit.
Bending stuff.
Well, maybe should we do the tillering before the bending?
Well, we need to straighten it before you tiller.
They kind of happen at the same time. Like we were doing both tillering and bending kind of in conjunction.
So, like if you have a really out of line, like you know, you have a stave that's got a big curve to it, and it's just not going to line up. You know, it's even hard to even start tillering because when you put that thing on the ground and push on it, just wants to roll in your hand, and it doesn't work out so good. And so you have to get it to some point where you can heat it up and bend it into rough alignment. So the nocks, again, with the center of the handle. And for that, I just use a heat gun, primarily just any old heat gun will work. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can get one at Home Depot for $25. Heat it up, and then when you heat Osage enough, the wood will actually plasticize, and you can bend that thing, and you can feel it bending. You know, you can feel when that wood gives up, or when it plasticizes, it'll start to sag. And you get it to that point, you bend it where you want it, and then you let it cool, and it'll hold that shape. And so you can take a very crooked stave and line those 3 points up in one plane. And
you were saying that Osage is a little bit unique as far as like being able to use heat to do that. Yeah, it reacts very well to heat, whereas some of the other woods are a little more resistant to it. They don't plasticize like that. And then some other ones like Eastern Red Cedar or Juniper, just flat out, you just can't do it. You know, they'll break. You know, the wood's just too brash.
And then, you know, using some clamps to keep it steady, and you had a couple of jigs, for example, like we got this reflex in the tips, you know, that we just kind of clamped something to. You already had a general shape and a board that we could clamp the bow to and work it that way.
Is there a specific curve that you like there?
Yeah, about like a 5-gallon bucket. That works pretty good.
Okay.
5-gallon bucket. There you have it. I did love how much stuff was just straight up eyeballed. I mean, we got the curve of our handles off of an old worn out grinder disc. So, I mean, that does go to show how not fancy you have to be. Not that being fancy is bad. Mark's over there.
Well, I'm not saying that it wasn't.
You like fancy, Mark. Mark likes fancy.
It was still you're still using a perfect circle. I don't know, like.
Well, it's just not like you had to go out and you had to go buy the jig for bow handles. You just used what you had around.
So. I also think Clay was making it look easy.
Oh, I completely agree. That said,
but people do get caught up. Like they want to know the radius of the circle. They want to know this and that, and it's like I don't know what the radius of the circle is. I just look around and find something that looks right, and I use that. And like if I'm making a recurve, which I don't have any right here. Like this bow's on the verge of being a recurve. The difference being like if when the bow is braced or strung, if the belly or if the string lays on the belly, or touches the belly, it's a recurve.
Okay.
With a long bow, the technical definition would be like there's no contact between the nocks. The string does not touch the bow again.
Okay.
But if I'm making a recurve, I'll use a tighter radius, something maybe like a paint can or even tighter. For your bow, Mark, we used I don't know, it was probably a 5-inch diameter circle for that. So I don't know, just pick out something that has a approximately radius that looks pretty good. And
then what are you doing? What are you doing with that thing? Like, how did you know, like, oh, with your bow, we're going to need a smaller diameter one than with Jim's bow?
Well, most of that I just use a pretty standard, maybe like an 8-inch or 10-inch diameter circle. For your bow, I went something a little smaller because the handle had a big knot right there where your handle was, which created that. We were able to tilt the handle over and just the natural form of the wood. But it also, it tipped sideways, but it also tipped forward. And so if I had used a bigger diameter circle, I'd have this really long fade, which you don't really need. And then it also decreases it takes up valuable real estate, which could be working limb. Right.
Okay.
And so by using a smaller diameter circle, I was able to get down into that dip a little bit and bring that fade down, and which gives us more working limb.
Okay.
Yeah. And explain too, just for reference as well, like what this reflex at the end is doing. I mean, for those, again, if you're not watching, we'll try and explain, but basically the whole bow throughout most of the center section, and certainly the section you're holding on to, is generally straight up and downish when it's unstrung. And then at the ends, again, before being strung up and looking like a bow, they sort of curve away from the handle. And so that's done for what reason?
Well, it depends on how deep you want to get it, how technical you want to get into it. But we were talking about a forced draw curve yesterday, and energy storage and all of that stuff. And so the function of reflex and recurve, it changes the shape of that forced draw curve. That changes how much energy storage the bow is capable of, but it also changes how the bow feels when you draw it.
Oh.
And so if you have a straight limb bow, like no reflex, no recurve, just a straight, flat bow, the curve is going to be more exponential shaped, right? It's going to be flat, or it's going to be fairly constant, and then as you reach full draw, it's going to start stacking up like this, and you're going to feel that, and it's going to feel like when you get to full draw, you're here, you might be gaining 2 pounds per inch, you might be gaining 3 pounds, 5 pounds, 7 pounds, 8 pounds. So if it's like this exponential curve, right? Mm-hmm. That's stacked. That's no good. You don't want that, because if you change your draw length by a 1/4 inch, well, you're significantly changing your weight, and it's uncomfortable to shoot. It's just all around no good.
Okay.
And so reflex and recurve changes that. It makes the bow store more energy up front in the. Got a horse going off. In the early part of the draw, and then smooths out that back side of the curve once you get closer to your full draw, and decreases that stacking effect. It makes a more comfortable shooting bow, and then it can also make a bow that stores more energy.
Oh,
okay.
Okay.
Cool. So you bend some stuff with this thing. Another thing that you want to do too is the heating of this bow sort of tempers the wood. You mentioned that a couple of times. Yep. That's why you weren't heating the back side of it, because the back side has to be pliable, it has to be able to stretch, kind of, be snappy. Mm-hmm. And if you harden that by heating it up, letting it cool, and heating it up and like tempering it, you're sort of compromising its ability to do its job. But the belly, that's what we were heating a fair amount, and that you didn't mind heating up. Yeah.
So when you heat wood like that with dry heat, it tempers the wood or hardens the wood. It makes it more compression resistant, but it makes it less tension resistant, and that's why you don't want to put very much dry heat on the back of the bow, because that's the whole job of the back, is to withstand that tension.
Yeah.
And you don't want to compromise that. But by heating the belly side, you'll actually improve its ability to withstand that compression. And that's one of the things we talked about hickory earlier in this thing. Hickory is a good bow wood, but it has a tendency, it's not very good in compression. So it's very good in tension. So you'll very rarely break a hickory bow on the back. What happens to hickory is the belly crushes, right? Because it's not very good in compression. But if you heat treat a hickory bow, if you take a dry heat and just cook the belly side, you'll harden it and actually make a pretty doggone good bow with hickory because you change the properties of that belly wood.
Interesting. Yeah. Man, that's pretty cool.
That is super cool.
Yeah.
And even another thing, too, just sticking with the heat, another funny thing that can happen with the heat is we saw on mine, we've got a couple of little hairline cracks going, but they were going in, you said, the right direction.
Yep. There's cracks that don't cause problems, and then there's cracks that do cause problems. And the cracks that don't cause problems, they're the ones that are what I call longitudinal cracks. So they just run with the grain. Mm-hmm. And as long as you've done your job right earlier and went with the grain, laid that bow out with the grain, all of those cracks will run right along, right down the center of your limb, no matter where that limb goes. If you have some wiggle or snake in it, those cracks will run right down there, and they're fine. They're not going to cause any problem at all. If you have a crack that runs across the grain, those are bad.
That's a no-go.
That's no good.
Yeah, because then your grain is, your fibers in there, or whatever it is that's causing all that strength is interrupted.
Yes.
No, I didn't get to see those, Jim. So
I know I didn't show you because I figured you'd get worried.
Yeah, your cracks give me anxiety.
There's actually, I think this bow has some. Let's see. If you look at right there. See, I've got them filled in with tight bond.
Oh, interesting. So on yours, you didn't necessarily even like sand them out or anything like that. They're just kind of in there.
Yep.
Yeah. They're just there. Character. It's already got character. Hardly even shot it.
Would you recommend, so like we put that
the urethane?
The urethane on. Does that kind of fill those in a little bit too? Will it catch those and fill that in? Or would you recommend putting something in to fill those?
If they, like, those were pretty small, but those, and the ones on this bow actually opened up fairly large. So I needed something to fill them in.
Okay. But yeah, the strength's all still there. So now let's talk about tillering, right?
Yeah.
Let's say we got a bow that's been up and you made it straight-ish enough. Pretty dang straight.
Yeah, straight enough.
Now we're going to tiller the thing.
Yep.
So this is where you got like the thing, it looks like a scene from The Village when they open up that barn. There's like a red dress hung up on the barn. Anyway, that's what I always think of when I see this thing.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Anybody who's seen The Village maybe knows what I'm talking about. But you've got this thing hung up on a wall, and you stick your bow in there, and then you're just you run it through its draw, or I guess you stretch the bow. Or what do you call that when you do it? Draw it?
Yeah. So there's a block that's attached to the wall, about 5.5, 6 feet up, and then down towards the base of the wall there's a pulley. And so through that pulley I have a rope run, and then the rope runs up the wall, hooks to the bowstring, and then the other end of that rope you can stand back and you can pull that rope, which draws the bow down while it's sitting on that block. That's called a Tillering Rack, and it's just one of the bow building tools. It allows you to stand back and just see how those limbs are bending, not only individually like on a nice arc, but then in relation to one another.
Yeah, and the ability to stand back.
Yes.
Like that's pretty important. Right?
Yeah. Because it gives you, it shows you things that you can't really see when you're right up on it. You can look at the symmetry of the bow, and that's very important.
And you're kind of looking at it, like you said a few times, it's not even so much that you're focusing really heavily on the bow. You almost got to, in some ways, loosen your focus on it and just look at the general shape. Mm-hmm. And it helps you see, because when again, if you're seeing this right now, you're drawing wood off the belly side of these limbs, and you're taking material away, so it's getting thinner and thinner. And it's easy to, I don't know, if you're a novice like us, it's easy to, and Clay, maybe it happens to you, but sometimes you tilt your scraper the wrong way. Sometimes you are winding up digging in a little heavy in one spot, and it gets a little bit light in another spot, so you're leaving more material and you're taking off more material elsewhere. And that causes the bow, then when you see it on the tillering rack, that's what causes the bow then to, you'll see a nice even curve, and then all of a sudden it'll go totally straight, and then you'll see a nice even curve maybe again on the ends. And wherever it goes straight, that's because it's stiffer there, so maybe you need to take more material there than the other spots or something like that. And that's kind of what you're doing, right? You're just trying to even everything out, make sure it's not having any of these weird stiff and then less stiff spots.
Yeah, yes, that's the basics of tillering. Is you're looking for those areas that are weak, and you just mark those so that you don't take any more wood off there, and then you take wood off the stiff areas, and you keep evening those things out, removing wood from the stiff areas, leaving the light areas alone, and you're trying to get that nice smooth arc over this whole thing.
If you didn't do that, like if you had a weaker area and then a real stiff area in a limb, is that going to cause a problem in terms of performance, or actual, like, does the weaker area then, is it doing a ton more work than it should be doing, and therefore maybe it's going to be compromised and could break? Or
yeah, so you can get away with minor minor stiff areas and weak areas for a time. But if they're major, if you have what's called a hinge, an area that's like an obvious, like you have a stiff spot and then there's one little area that's weak, well, it'll almost form like an angle. Like you'll have an arc, and then the radius like changes really quickly. It'll start bending, like on an angle.
Okay.
Those areas, again, sometimes you can get away with them for a time, but every time you shoot that bow, that weaker area is having to work harder, and those stronger areas aren't doing their fair share of work, and so that weaker area just gets worn out, and the stronger areas will overpower it, and the bow will end up either breaking or just not performing well.
Okay.
And so a lot of times those areas will just stay bent. They get crushed. The belly side get crushed, and they just don't have that snap like they should.
Yeah. You were talking a little bit too about when we were tillering, there can be some things that are like somewhat deceiving. You're like, oh, well, this limb is bending way more than this other one, but the other one is already kind of started out in a different position or slightly different position. So like, what's going on there?
Yeah. So like a lot of this stuff, it's going to be difficult to understand unless you're watching it happen.
Right.
But you think, wood, these staves are natural material, right? They're not cut out uniform material. And so if you have a bow that has, like, say, the bottom limb has some back set, which means that if you put the bow on this rack with the back facing up, so the part that faces away from you when you shoot it, that facing up, back set would be, that limb kind of curves up towards the roof. And then you have the other limb, the one on the right-hand side, that has some, it curves in the other direction. Well, if you put a string on that thing and pull it, well, the one with that curves down towards the ground is going to look like it's bending a lot, even though it's probably not. It was just already there. You know? And so, little things like that, like you just have to take that into account and realize that, no, this right limb really isn't doing more work. It was just already bent. And then that's one of the things that we changed on your bow is we heated that. You actually had that problem. Yeah. And so we heated that limb and actually made it match the other limb.
Yeah, we kind of gave the one some back set.
Yeah.
Yeah, we heated mine a fair bit. I don't know if it's like the one I'm sure you've had ones up there more where you've had to heat them more, but sometimes I remember you saying you can just be there forever, just heating, changing, changing.
Yeah, well, you change one thing and you see how that makes things align, and then you just keep on making adjustments. And then sometimes, when you'll fix one thing and then you see something else you got to fix, and if you heat the same area that you fixed the first thing, then your first problem comes back again. So you got to fix both. Yeah, so it can be a little bit of chasing your tail sometimes on those things.
for sure. Yeah, but it turned out all right. I'm eager to show it, but like we said, it's still drying.
It's still drying.
One of the sweet things I think you've done, is like let's talk about the handles a bit. And Mark, you're holding one that's pretty trick. Wait, you have that one, right? Or does Clay have that one?
I got
Which
it.
one's the one?
This
That
one, I
one's the
think.
one that splits in two. But making the handle though too, that was pretty fun.
Yeah.
That was a cool part because there's parts of the bow that, like your limbs in the middle, those you want to be fairly conservative with once they're pretty much down to the spots they're going to be at. You don't want to just go whittling away a bunch of stuff or trying to make super cool designs or something like that in them because they're very structural. The handle was pretty fun though because we got to make something that fit our hands and there's not a whole lot of stress going into the handle, so you can kind of make it nice. And if you want to make it a little bit more petite or want to do something a little bit more unique with it, we could do that. You've even done some of these handles like this guy here that's actually a takedown, makes it a takedown bow.
Yeah. Yeah, so the handle's not really, it's not bending, so it's not a critical part of the bow. But you can see that one's made into, it's like put that one in your backpack.
That thing is sweet.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I like that little bow.
And you plug that back in, put the string back on, she's just good to go, huh?
Yep, and you can cover this with some sort of wrap like this one's covered with rawhide.
Oh, okay.
And you put it back together, you never know it was two-piece.
I was going to ask what the grip was on that bow. And that's the bow that you hunt with a lot, right?
Yeah. Yep.
The one you're holding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's just covered with rawhide there.
And that's a 1 or 2 piece bow?
This is 2-piece.
It is 2 piece. Okay, yep.
Oh, shoot. I never would have known.
Yeah.
No.
And I leave them, like the reason I started making 2 pieces is because I sometimes get on an airplane and travel.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, there's no reason to have it. But man, I tell you, when you're traveling with these things, a 2-piece is the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you just have like a taper fit basically there, right? I mean, there's kind of what do they call that?
Tenon?
Tenon?
Yeah, it's like a tenon and socket type deal on these limbs. But I show how to do this. I've got a thing in my book on how to do this, and it's also on my Patreon site. But it's basically just like a recessed, you recess this thing all the way around the bow except for on the back. And then you fill in that, you cut it, and then you fill in that recess or you replace that removed material with like a fiberglass tape and epoxy.
Yeah.
And once that sets up, if you tapered your tenon right and smoothed everything out, it'll just pop out like that. And then you're left with this rigid handle socket that your tenon fits right back in.
That's super cool.
Can you take like a 1-piece bow like the bows Jim and I have now and do that later, or has that train sailed and you had been thinking about that before?
Nope. Yes, you can absolutely do that as long as you have enough meat left in your handle to do it.
Okay.
So you can do that, and then you could also join billets, which are just shorter sections of stave, into a bow like that.
Okay.
I think this one was I can't remember. Maybe this was 2 billets that I joined. But anyway, it doesn't matter. It comes out the same.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Like you said, Jim, I mean, that was a really cool part of the process. One of the things that I liked about it is just because essentially you were just sanding. There was less danger of removing too much material, even though it did stress me out at one point, because holding this 2-piece bow is really, I was talking earlier, this was like my worst nightmare of happening throughout the process. But yeah, I mean, it was a opportunity to, I mean, all these bows are really super unique and in really every attribute, but that's, definitely a spot where it seems like you can customize it. Maybe a spot where you do want to customize it because everybody's hand is a little bit different.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's what I felt too. Yeah, the whole rest of it was very much like utilitarian. Let's make this thing function. Let's make it work. And then it got to the handle. I was like, well, now I'm going to make it fit my hand.
Right. And then you
cool.
could you'd shave away or use the rasp or whatever and do a little bit and check it for your hand, and then a little more, check it, like, oh, I want to remove a little bit more material here, I don't like the way my thumb feels, I want to be able to wrap my finger all the way around.
Yeah.
That was cool.
Yeah, we made speaking of, also I guess this is a bit of personalization, but this kind of some people might have different people might have the same setting. Weight on the bow was another thing that we were able to kind of tune, so to speak, with our tillering process, right? So you had a scale between that pulley and the bow, and as we were pulling on it, we were able to see at what length of draw, what poundage that was pulling. Then we were going for somewhere around like 45 to 50 on ours, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's one of the big questions I get is how do you, first of all, can you make a bow of so-and-so weight? Like, is it possible? And people, for some reason, they find it hard to believe that you can make these bows like 70 pounds or 80 pounds or something like that. You can make these bows as heavy or as light as you want.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, they used to, like the British longbowmen?
Yeah, they were.
I don't know if those were self bows or if those were composites, but
they were English U self bows, and they were pulling well over 100 pounds, 150 pounds. But yeah, you can make the bows whatever weight you want, and you guys saw through the process. At first, when you first put it on that rack and pull it, all you're doing is looking for major inconsistencies from side to side. You're just looking to get the bow bending evenly. Now, then once you get it bending evenly, you may be really heavy. It may be, if you were to pull it all the way to 28 inches, it might be 70, 80 pounds or more. And so you have to keep removing wood, keep scraping wood off the belly while maintaining that even bend until you arrive at you'll eventually remove enough wood so that you arrive at whatever, your target draw weight is.
Now, one thing that I noticed is that we probably could have, like when you have it on the wall, you had a couple of marks on the wall that indicated this is where a 26-inch draw would be, a 28-inch draw would be, and you could pull the bow down to the point where that scale and where it was hooked onto the string would go down to the 26 or the 28. But it would take a significant amount of force. We were shooting, like I said, for like ballpark 50 pounds on that thing. And you were saying, don't go over 55. Like, don't pull the thing so much that the scale reads over 55, because somehow that could almost put like a set into the wood or something.
Yeah. So the trick is to, throughout this process, you're slowly working a little more draw, a little more draw, a little more draw. So you're working those limbs down into more of a bend. And the trick is to arrive at your draw length and your draw weight at the same time. So you don't want to hit, your draw length, but still be way heavy, because you're overstressing that wood. If you have a 28-inch draw and you're shooting for a 50-pound bow, well, you could draw it to 28 inches while the limbs are still too heavy. They may be 70 pounds at 28 inches. And then you could just continue to remove wood, and eventually get it to 50 at 28, but you've already stressed that wood more than it needed to be. And so I tell everybody that comes, takes the classes, like, if don't go above about 5 pounds over your draw weight, the weight that you want, even though you might be getting at that weight at, 20 inches or 22 inches or something like that. You need to take more wood off. If you're hitting 50 pounds at 22 inches, don't pull it to 28. Take more wood off, and then just keep working it down slowly.
Sure.
Yep. Yeah. One thing that I thought was, as we kind of got down to this step in the process where you've got the bow up there and you found that, I guess, that symmetry between the limbs where they're flexing, essentially identically. That's when you really have to slow down, and you're literally counting scrapes, like, 15 off this side, 15 off the other side, and really being mindful of the amount of wood you're taking off both sides, because you're really only working on one limb at a time.
Yeah.
So you kind of do one, flip it around, and do the other. That seemed pretty important.
Yeah, because once you've got when you start getting close to a finished bow, you start getting close to that draw length and that draw weight. It didn't take much to change the way that bow draws.
No.
If you take off, 5 extra scrapes in one area, you could be taking off, half a millimeter of wood, and that can be major. in the very final stages of the tillering process. And so you really gotta watch it. You gotta kind of sneak up on it a little bit.
Yeah.
So you make a lot of trips back and forth, right? You go up to the tillering rack, you look at it, you see where you need to adjust, where you need to take off wood. You come back, you put it in the shaving horse, you take a little off. You go back to the tillering rack, you repeat that process as many times as you need to get to your final draw length and your draw weight. Because if you get impatient, you take a little bit too much wood off and you make a weak area, well, then you have to take wood. You can't just leave it there.
Right.
You have
Everything
to take wood off everywhere else to match that weak area. And then, if you were close to your draw weight, your desired draw weight, well, now you've overshot it and you end up with a lightweight bow.
Yeah.
And that's most people that are building their first couple of bows, they're going to end up, they may want a 55-pound bow, but they're probably going to end up with a 25-pound bow because you make those, it's just a natural thing. You make those mistakes and that's how you learn. You make a mistake late in the process and then you fix that mistake. But you end up with a bow that's a little bit lighter than you might have wanted.
Mark, I think you were a bit more patient than I was because I noticed you didn't have as many trips back and forth to the tillering rack as I did. I had far more of times where I was getting sent back not to scrape the entire limb, but to do this part and then don't touch that. Do this part and you flip it around. Don't touch any of that. Just do this little part, And
I had my fair share of that. Clay would, which actually just with the pencil, which I thought was cool. You'd be like, mark off. Don't cut wood here, or don't shave off wood here, and
well, we're trying to hit to a certain value, and like you say, it wasn't like we were trying to go for exactly, it's one number. Because another thing you said, Clay, is that after you use the bow a little bit, it's going to go down naturally. So you might finish the bow at spot on 50 pounds at 28 inches or 26 inches or whatever, and then after you use it for a while, it sounds like it'll go down a bit to where at that same length later on it might be 48, 47 or something.
And does it generally, it kind of settles at that point then?
Yeah, in my experience, the bows will, initially, if you shoot it a bunch, it'll drop a couple of pounds, but then they typically kind of settle out. Like this bow here's been 53 pounds at 28 inches for years,
What do you is that about an optimal for big game hunting? You find about that 50-pound mark, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's no need to shoot anything over, I'd say 50. I mean, you can kill any animal in North America with a 55-pound bow. Mm-hmm. And the heavier bows are just harder on you. They're harder on your body. I don't shoot them as accurately. Mm-hmm. So I like that. I like that, mid 50s, 50 to 55 pound range. Mm-hmm. But I have a relatively, my draw is almost 29 inches. So I get a little bit more power stroke than somebody with a 26-inch draw.
Gotcha.
Okay. Right on. Did we miss anything?
I've covered a lot. What about...
Well, you're never... Yeah, and I'm sure we missed some little intricacies because there were many.
There were many. Cutting the nocks in. There was a few spots where I was glad that you were doing it.
Yeah,
you using some specialized tools, and also it's like...
Cutting out the shelf and cutting out the nocks at the end.
Yeah. Again, though, Jim, Clay doing those steps... The bow's we've been working on this thing for 2 days. Clay comes in, draws the line...
Big saw.
Japanese saw.
Yeah.
Learned what that is. And
Google it, you'll know.
Chisel. And just boom, boom, boom.
Yep.
What angle? What angles were you using there? How did you even know? It looked like you just went for it.
Done it a time or two. But I'm like, how deep you can go with those shelves. I'm just looking at the how deep the handle is, how deep the riser section is. How wide the limbs are, and just, over time, I've just got a feel for how deep I can go and still have enough material there to support the stress that's being placed on it. The angles, I'm just going at the top of the handle and drawing a little line and sawing that in there, and then using that saw as a stop for my chisel cuts.
Okay.
Chisel that shelf in there.
I think Cooper's got some really cool footage of that. So
yeah,
if anybody's
absolutely.
Curious, he's got really great footage of the whole process, really. and then
the nocks at the end.
Cutting in the nocks.
A tile cutting.
Yeah, tile saw.
Tile saw.
just a little round carbide blade that fits on a hacksaw. Works pretty doggone good.
I mean,
I'd say so.
That is one thing that's just absolutely amazing to me because, I mean, there's a lot of force and a lot of stress on these bows.
Held on by that little
I mean,
guy.
yeah, the limb tips are small enough when they're not cut. And then now, I mean, there's just not a lot there.
Yeah. Yep. Doesn't take much.
That's
Physics.
crazy to me.
Physics.
And
Sometimes
I guess
you need a lot of it. Sometimes you're shocked at how little of it you need.
Exactly. On top of that, Clay, you're talking about using your bow as a walking stick at times.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not like you got some, delicate flower here. I mean, these things are built to be used.
I love that. Don't see a lot of compound guys out there using their compound bows as walking sticks.
Well, no, my cams will get all gummed up, Jim.
Oh, no, my cams. my cams.
Ain't got no cams to worry about on this one.
That's right.
Yeah, I was going to ask when we add the wheels, but apparently not.
I dig it. It is a sweet process, and as we mentioned, Clay has got pretty much the whole dang process on YouTube. You can see it. I remember watching. It was a while back when I was trying to get my first trad bow. I watched the whole process on how to make one out of a Home Depot maple board, and it's pretty cool. I definitely we can't recommend enough. Come down to try it with him, take a class, or try it yourself if you're interested in this sort of thing. It's very, very rewarding.
Super rewarding. I mean, something that I've been really curious about for a long time. And I don't know, like, am I a professional bow builder? No, but I'm a heck of a lot better than I was. And I don't know, man. I feel like I've grown as an outdoorsman.
This just keeps making me want to go back to Arizona again.
I should do that.
and
You just
get
wait
redemption.
till you find yourself 5 yards from a big game animal with that bow in your hand.
You'll get a phone call shortly afterwards. I guarantee it.
Yeah. I just want some pictures.
Pictures, indeed.
Hopefully we can give you some.
Very cool. Well, Clay, thanks as usual. And we do have one more here, though, because in order to be able to shoot said animal at 5 yards, and even at 5 yards, you should at least know how to shoot the dang thing. But even at some greater distances as well, it ain't like something easy, chewing bubble gum.
No.
And walking at the same time. Sometimes for some people that's not easy, but it ain't as easy as that. It's a bit more complicated, and Clay is quite good at it. So he's going to tell us a little bit of some tips and tricks to how to shoot these things really well. And probably in that one, we might even have our bows as visual aids that you can check out too. So we'll see you on the next one.
All
Thanks,
right.
Clay.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cool, man. I noticed this towards the very end.
Big hole in it.
I know. I kept looking at that too. And I'm like, am I seeing that right?
Was that like some beetle that
Yeah.
it's
a grub hole.
and no problem.
Is that
It's just in there.
before building bow? Okay.
The carpenter ants got to it.
There's another one in the side there.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's cool.
It probably actually was carpenter ant.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah.
Bastards.
Don't care for it.
Is there going to be anything goofy about this when you use it? Or is it just going to be like using any other bow?
I don't. There shouldn't be.
I feel like making it's got to be just a interesting, trying to draw your knife along here, and it goes in and out this way and over here and over there,
That
trying
one,
to keep it even.
That one, the grain's really, it's compressed in areas and then it's wide in areas, so it's not like, you can't just run a ring off like some of the cleaner would.
Yeah. Very neat. There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.